All right. So we want to welcome Valerie Mitchell today. She is an esteemed professor here at Alliant International University. Valerie Mitchell graduated from the University of California, Berkeley in 1983 with a PhD in psychology. As a graduate student, she joined the Mills study of adult development. She has continued to work with the study across 40 years. At the same time, she was faculty for Alliant University, where she rose to the rank of distinguished professor and was coordinator of the school's Institute for the Psychology of Women, its gender studies program, and its social justice track. She has published in many academic journals, including several articles about the Mills study, which is now the largest and longest academic study of women's development, and the focus of the book, Women on the River of Life, which we're talking about today. She also has a practice of psychotherapy in Berkeley, California. And I want to share the screen briefly, just so we can look at the book title. I want to give you guys a chance. You can buy this on Amazon. It's currently available. Women of the Study of Life. I had this up because I was reading it last night, so it's here available for purchase if you'd like. All right. That being said, we'll go ahead and begin the interview. Hi, Valerie. How are you doing today?
Hi, Dean. It's nice to see you. Thank you all for coming.
So I wanted to start off with the questions. I'm very excited to speak about this because I got a chance to look at the book, and it's wonderful, and it has a lot of great stuff in it. I personally, after looking at this, I think it would be a wonderful book for anybody to read for many reasons. It's social issues, the gender issues, women's rights issues. I think that any student who is going to undertake doing dissertation would be well advised to look at this book, because it outlines what you had to go through to create a study, and it's all very important stuff. So I'm hoping to get several copies for the library and all the other libraries across the university system. So that's something that we could look through in the next few months. Now, you begin the Mills study, a study of the lives of 142 women over the span of 50 years. Starting in 1958 with a group of young women who were seniors at Mills College. How did this study begin?
Well, I was not there when the study began. It was began by my co-author and my graduate school mentor, Dr. Ravenna Helson. And this was the 1950s. And the good news was right after the Second World War, the University of California got a lot of the psychologists who had been trying to figure out how to make good personnel decisions during the Second World War, and brought them together to create the Institute for Personality Assessment and Research. And the Institute got grants to study creativity. And it was in that context that the study really began. It was started as a study of women's creative and leadership potential, and was conceived of as kind of one module within this array of studies of creativity that were going on at the Institute. Ravenna was the only woman on the Institute staff, and if you kind of think how things were in the 1950s, it's not surprising that she was handed the job of studying creativity in women. And she did that. She studied several groups of women. She studied creative women mathematicians and creative authors of fantasy literature for children. But she had this opportunity to begin the Mills study. And what she hoped to find out about was what happens in the lives of young women who are who clearly have creativity and leadership potential. So the study was structured in a way that she chose Mills College, partly because I think partly because it was convenient to Berkeley. It was, right here in Oakland, but also because it was a private women's college. Um, and the women who went there in the 1950s um, were likely to be fairly privileged women and to have, some financial resources and, um, a set of values that would support them. And so if you were going to find women for whom the obstacles against realizing their creativity would be less, it might be from a pool like this one. So she went to Mills College and she asked the faculty to nominate students that they knew had creative or leadership potential. And the study was actually structured into 3 groups. So there were the creative nominees, and then there was a control group of young women who were matched for all kinds of things, grade point average and, things that might otherwise be used to explain differences. So they were matched as a control group. And then she opened the study up to all the other senior girls at Mills. Anybody who wanted to participate in the study could also join in. That being said, the creative nominees and the control group were both invited to the Institute for day-long assessments. This was a very special thing about the Institute of Personality Assessment and Research, that they did these day-long assessments where they would bring people to the Institute and spend a 12-hour day with them. And there would be probably 2 psychologists for every participant. They would observe them all day long. They, when they started out the morning and they gave them, coffee and muffins and they stood around and chatted, and then they had interviews, they had testing, they had leaderless group discussions, they had just all sorts of things, sat with them at lunch and dinner, but all the time trying to get an impression of who were these participants and what were they like. And at the end of the day, after the dinner, they even played charades and used what they found out about people in that context to flesh out their view. And then for several days after the participants left, the observers would fill out checklists and ratings and all sorts of structured quantitative ways to document their observations. And so we have those data for the creative nominees and the comparison group. And then we have basically paper and pencil materials for the other participants at that first round of data collection. So that's how it started.
Thank you. My second question is, I love the title, Women on the River of Life. Can you tell me how this title was created or who came up with it?
Oh, I'm not sure that I can tell you who came up with it. We had, I was Ravenna's student as a graduate student, and our relationship, continued for, up through the present. So it's been a long, long time. And what was noteworthy from the very beginning is that the 2 of us just loved to talk with each other. And we would just talk and talk and talk and talk, and we'd talk about all the different women in the study and why did this one do this, did you think, and what about that? And I think the title just kind of emerged between us in that way. Couple of things about it that I think are important. First is that the very first word in the title is women. It's very important to us that that women are front and center. There really are no large, academically rigorous, long-term studies of women's adult development. This is really the one. There are smaller studies for smaller spans of time, or studies that are, primarily interview studies. But this is really it. And that's in contrast to a number of studies of men. And so we really wanted to say, okay, if you really want to take a look at women's adult life course, this is it. This is women. And then the part about the river, we love the image of the river for a number of reasons. We felt like it said so much. One thing that was so important is that, you know, a river is constantly moving and life is constantly moving and it carries you along. And we wanted to have that idea just from the very beginning that everyone, you know, gets into the river and moves along with the course of the river over time and in a direction. And you know, then as we thought about it even more, we felt like it was also spoke to that, you know, rivers usually start out with some little spring somewhere, some small way of beginning. And people do too. People start out in the small environment of, you know, usually of just their family. And then the river moves along and often it gets bigger and it ends, you know, in entering into a lake or an ocean, some vast body of water. And we felt like, you know, from a psychological standpoint, that was true too, that these lives that started in these little tiny places, you know, grew and grew and grew and grew to the point that, you know, I think some of our women, you know, talking to them in their 70s, really had a vision of themselves as citizens of the world, where the kind of the whole world was their family, and they felt themselves as you know, one member of humanity, and that their caring and their identification was, you know, was as vast as kind of going into that ocean. So it just felt like the right image for our title.
I want to ask about, this was a study of just women. Now,
Yes.
was that unique at this time period, and was there any kind of trouble or blowback from that at all?
That's a good question. Yes, it was unique at that time. Interestingly, there were well, you know, in the middle of the 20th century and before, and for a good while after that, um, it was often mainly men who were studied, and women just weren't part of the population. And some of that, you know, is because of, you know, large systemic sex segregation. You know, if you wanted to do, well, one of the most famous studies is a study of the adult lifespan of Harvard graduates. Well, when it started, the only Harvard graduates were men. So it's a study of men. In this instance, I think it was done in a time period, you know, that I tried to kind of hint at that when talking about how the study began, that women were like this little subgroup. You know, we're going to study creativity, and one little group you might study is women. And this was at a time where there was considerable uncertainty about whether women really were creative. And so there was a spirit, you know, it was sort of the Sputnik space race kind of time, and they were looking high and low for creative people. Well, maybe we could even find some among women. Imagine that. So it was sort of in that context that women became an entity. To give you an idea, another entity was creative writers, all men. They were studied as one series of studies. So it was like this little sort of special group. Well, let's look at women. And it was, of course, absolutely intentional that they did. Now, Ravenna was very much a feminist researcher before the women's movement even happened. So even in 1958, she was interested in the psychology of women. Now, APA didn't have any psychology of women. There was no division for psychology of women. There was certainly no gender studies or anything like that. But she was interested in women's lives and what happened to women and how did they develop, and, you know, what did they cope with. And so she came forward into the study with a genuine curiosity and a real interest in just finding out, you know, what happens here? What's the psychology of what's going on? She did run into obstacles, and especially at the beginning. She wrote a monograph on her first round of data collection and submitted it, and it was rejected, and they wrote to her and said, well, your sample is too small, but even if you had 1,000 women, we wouldn't be interested in publishing it. So there was a kind of a feeling, well, women, you know, women really are the outliers, and, you know, they don't really speak for the normative path of development. And a lot of people just weren't that interested. So she did run into some of that. I think, you know, by the time I was involved in the study, the women's movement had come in, and it had influence everywhere. And adult development had come on the scene as well. And so it was a good time for us to really transform the study from a study of creative potential into a study of adult development, which is what we did when I came on board.
As we spoke earlier, you know, looking through the book and reading some of the stories, and then seeing the photographs from the book, I was really, it was jarring to like think about the changes that came across in society since it was started, and what the individuals, subjects of the study went through in their whole lives. I mean, because we've had significant change since the beginning of the study to now. And I just want to like, do you have any like observations or stories from that, from this, looking at the span of time and seeing the change in the subjects? Do you have anything you want to talk about with that?
Well, sure. I think, you know, certainly the biggest influence on these women as a group was the women's movement. These folks, you know, they were graduating college at a time when the social expectation was that a successful woman graduates from college, gets married, and starts having children right away. I mean, so much so that we set age 27. If you hadn't started having children by 27, you were late. Okay, clearly, that's gone. You know, the timing norms for you know, forming a couple relationship, for having children, are just vastly expanded. And with that expansion, of course, comes all sorts of choice that people have. Well, do I want to have children now? Do I want to wait? You know, when would be a good time? What do I want to have in place when I start having my children? You know, those were questions that really weren't available to these women. Another thing was that what we talk about as the family project, the family social clock project. We had this idea of social clock, that there are certain things that your society sanctions, like having a family. And the clock part is that there's timing norms for that. And that people, you know, kind of measure their feeling of success as a person to whether they're on time with these socially sanctioned projects. Well, at that time, for women, there really was only the family project as a sanctioned project. Career was a minority project. It was conceptualized as something that you might dip into when it when the family didn't need you. But the idea that a woman would graduate from college, do her next round of training or experience to launch a career and have a continuous career was not an idea that was available to these women. And when we asked them you know, as seniors in college, you know, what do you plan to do? That's what they all said. Almost all of them. I think there was only one out of 142 who didn't say anything about having children. They just, that was what all of them expected to do. A few also wanted a career. and would often be thinking about it, well, how long do you want to work? Until I get married, until I have my children, and then again when they're in school. But it was very much conceptualized as surrounding the family project. All of that has changed. And what was, interesting and very exciting and sometimes really tumultuous for these women is that they launched their projects, and then the women's movement hit, and they all of a sudden they thought, oh, I could do this differently. Oh, and many of them set out to make changes to do it differently. And some of them remained really traditional. But it was an enormous, enormous impact on this cohort of women. And there were other things too. We have some stories to tell. You know, same-sex couples were considered a mental illness, when these women were graduating from college, and none of them acknowledged being lesbian. Well, now, we have, several women who've come out in the course of time in our study, but certainly would not have said anything about it when the study began. So that's changed, and it's changed in not only what they say to us, but how they live their lives. So I think that was really a meaningful difference. Also, I think the whole counterculture hippie movement, landed on them when they were, well into their 20s. And some women just kind of ignored it, but some women really jumped on it. And, we have one woman whose story we tell in the book who had set up this very conventional life, that her husband, had gotten his degree and he was going to work, and she was, doing socially approved volunteer activities. And then they started getting involved with some of these other things. They wound up, he quit his job, they moved to the country, they got off the electricity grid, they, built yurts and, and lived there, raised their kids there, with no electricity. And she, she talked with us about that over time, and really felt very, very good about her choices. And they eventually started a summer camp for people coming out to the country with their kids in the summertime. And they did that for quite a long time. She eventually became a Tai Chi instructor.
Nice.
So she's probably the person who was most influenced by that sweep in history. But I think, I think there's indications that a lot of women were affected by these things. So very much a lot of these big social kind of sweeps of history had a big impact on these women.
This is the wordy question that I gave you.
Okay.
This is the one that was really wordy. Scholars resist an essentialist definition that implies that all women are the same. On the other hand, feminists agree that denying the shared properties among women is as absurd as ignoring the vast differences among us. From your study, what have you learned that gives you some idea of the things that unite women and underscore the shared properties?
Okay. Well, I should start by saying that our study was started at an Institute for Personality. It was very much focused on the study of personality and personality development across the lifespan. And in that sense, the study of personality is the study of differences among people. This person is high on this trait, but this person is low on this trait. And how are their lives different as a result of that? So we looked a lot at how these women were different, and we saw, patterns. We often will talk about, maybe setting up 3 groups of women and how are they different and how do their personalities differ. So there's a lot about what doesn't unite them in the book. But I think overall that one of the things that's really clear are that as you step back, you really can see commonalities. I think the strongest one to me is the across the board, the incredible power of personality in influencing what people do with their life. You know, that it just over and over again, it's like we, you know, because we saw them for such a long time and because we measured personality every time, we could discover things like how you scored on some traits at 21 predicted your attitudes about retirement at 71. You know, it's just in there. And when you start looking at, you know, well, here's a woman who led a very traditional life, or here's a group of women who led very traditional lives, and there are things about their personality that are different than the women who were successful careerists. So this real strong impact is something that they all share. And I think that they all shared a basic shape of the life course. And I tend to think that that shape continues to be descriptive, an accurate description. I think that in early adulthood, people are very involved in launching their projects. You know, they're launching their family project, they're launching their work project, or some combination of the two. And that as they get older, what we talk about is those are the social clock projects, and people are really motivated to launch those social clock projects and maintain them. And as you get older, the power of that pull becomes less and less. You've done whatever you did. You know, you had a career or you didn't. You know, raised your kids. And so when you get further in life and toward the second half of life, your life becomes shaped much more by the kind of development that you value. So, you know, different people, you know, value different things, and they put effort and work into making a life that's consistent with their identity, with their motivations. And I think that that remains true as a good description of the life course. When you get beyond that, then you get into particulars. And I think historically, people have tried to claim that there's a much more of a stair-step kind of linear path that everybody should follow for a successful life. We didn't find that. We found that people, you know, can succeed at doing different things at different times. And that there's a lot of different ways to have a successful life. But I do think that those big shapes and then some of the things that become developmentally important for people in the second half of life, when they're not putting so much energy on their work and their family, that they really begin to go to work on things like generativity, you know, really their care for others, or their care for making the world a better place, you know, really self-development, you know, individuation, that those things begin to really loom large. And these are all things that I think all women have in common. They may not all do them to the same extent, and certainly not in the same way, but the big themes remain the same.
So the next question is kind of an unfair one, but
Okay.
I'm going to throw it at you anyway. What was what do you think was the biggest surprise that you encountered in this study? I mean, it's an unfair question because it was a long study, but if you could have a takeaway from what your biggest surprise was, what would that be?
Yeah. You know, it's a tricky question, because there were a number of things that kind of surprised me. And I think the thing that surprised me the most was, and this probably partly has to do with, you know, even though I'm only like 10 years younger than these women, my sense of possibility was much different than theirs. But I think I was surprised by how courageous and determined a number of these women were, and how it took this incredible courage and determination for them to hold on to their creative identity. You know, they You know, their parents criticized them, their husbands criticized them. You know, they were really, you know, feeling like they were swimming upstream a lot of the time. And yet, you know, like we like to say today, she persists. They persisted, you know, and some of them took big leaps. One woman, she had an opportunity for a job in another state. She packed up her 3 kids. Her husband wasn't in support. She took the 3 kids, off she went, got the job, made a life, and eventually, you know, the husband decided he would join her too. But wow, what a step to have to take in order to maintain this sense of yourself and not just accommodate to what other people wanted. So I think that was the biggest surprise for me, just the amount of courage and determination that they had to have.
The next question is, you were much younger than many of the women in this study when you came into it, but even so, what were some of the touchstones that you felt within your life and their life? What was a commonality that you found?
Well, I think, you know, I think I've alluded to, you know, the big difference for me that, you know, that I didn't have those really constricting mandates, that, you know, that everybody said, you know, if you're going to be a success as a woman, you must do this and you must do it now. So you know, and I was, you know, a person of my time. It was very, very much suited to me. So I dropped out of college, which was quite widely supported at the time. Oh, let's all drop out. So I did. And I had a lot of adventures for several years. I drove around the country with my friend in my Volkswagen bus and, you know, all of that kind of 60s stuff. And I'm really glad that I did, you know. And if I had been born 10 years earlier, I, it was just unthinkable. It's just unthinkable in 1958. You know, so those are the differences. But I think, you know, as I look back on my life, certainly the timing was quite different, but family and work have been very important to me. You know, that, you know, I've had a wonderful long career. I have a daughter who's in her 30s now. And these were very, very important things that were central in my day-to-day experience for years and years, for decades, you know. And as I described, you know, the older that I got, the more I began to think, well, okay, I'm so happy about these things and they're so important to me. And yet, you know, nobody's really saying, oh, you should do this or you should do that. And I have a little more wiggle room to think about, well, you know, are there things that I'm feeling are sort of coming up from inside that I want to think about or reflect on or put my energy onto? And so I think in that way that my life fundamentally has a very similar structure to the life structure of these women's adulthood.
Very nice, thank you. How did the research evolve over time? What were some of the things that you saw? Because I know that research in general, you know, the way we do it changes over time. So, and this was a significant amount of time. So how did that change?
Well, in so many ways. Technologically, you know, when before I got on the study, was before they had computers, and all the statistical analyses were run by people on adding machines. So you can imagine how arduous it was to try and run even the smallest statistical analysis. And when I got there, we used to do what computers had. A computer had arrived. There was one big computer on the campus, and you to enter your data, you punched holes in cards with a little machine, and then you picked up the box of cards and you carried it across the campus to the computer building and dropped it off. Well, all of that has changed, and with it, you know, we can do a zillion analysis from your living room. You know, all the data are there. The computers have capacity that we couldn't even have imagined. So, and it's everywhere, as a result of the size of the analyses, our way of thinking about personality has changed. When I started out, the big measure was the California Psychological Inventory. And there was the MMPI for people with mental illness, and then the CPI to measure effective functioning personality. And as time has passed, people have done these enormous factor analyses and come out as a result of the capacity to do that with the big 5 traits. Those big 5 traits were emerged through these massive factor analyses. And so one of the things that we had to do is we wanted to stay current. We wanted to be able to talk about personality in terms of the big 5. So fortunately for us, we had colleagues at the Institute. The CPI had like 400 and something items. And so we had colleagues at the Institute who, again, using factor analysis, could reconfigure those items into measures of the big 5 traits. So now we could talk about these women, even when they were 20, in terms of how they scored on the big 5 personality traits. So there were things like that we had to do the extra work to stay current. The other thing I should say is that after the first assessment at the Institute, all of the research was done, well, not all of it, but the great majority of it was done through the mail. So we would send folks out the personality inventory, and maybe another measure. We measured used the Levenger sentence completion test of ego development a couple of times. But mainly we sent them these humongous questionnaires. We asked them about everything. And we asked them about everything in every way we could think of. So we had checklists and rating scales, and we had a chronology chart where for every year they had a space to write what happened that was important to them that year. We had short answers, long answers, page-long essays, just every format of data collection that we could think of. But fortunately, we could embed within those questionnaires new measures. So when the study started, attachment theory had not yet been invented, but then it was, and we thought it was very important. And so we wanted to measure attachment. And so we were able to use a relatively brief measure of attachment. And so we had the ability to categorize all of the Mills women on attachment style. And a few years later, Carol Reif came out with her 6 scales of effective functioning, and measured things like, well, the one that I know best is she had a measure of purpose in life. So we were able to include that in our questionnaires, and then we could write about, women at 60 and 70 who were high on purpose in life, low, went from low to high, went from high to low, and what was different among these 4 groups of women in terms of their personality and their experiences. So these were all ways that we worked hard to really, stay integrating new ideas in psychology into the research.
So I want to go to the last question, then we'll start taking questions from the people who are attending, the participants. Last question is, we've come a long way as a society in our treatment of women. Have we come a long way in our society in our treatment of women? What has changed in your mind, and what has remained the same since the study began?
Oh my. Well, I think I've spoken to some of that. Certainly the timing norms have vastly changed, and I think with them, the recognition that, being a wife and a mother is really not the only goal that women will have in their adult lives. And so lots of things follow from that. I don't think we're all the way there yet. I think, and when I say that, it's still the case that women do the lion's share of the caregiving, whether it's that they are primarily responsible for child rearing, they're primarily responsible for elder care, and when someone gets sick, they're primarily responsible for housework. So it's a work in progress, but I think that we have really made enormous changes in those regards. You know, when this study started, when people looked for a job, the jobs were listed: help wanted men and help wanted women. And they were two segregated, sex segregated lists of jobs. Well, that's gone, sort of. But we're still working very hard to legitimate girls going into STEM careers. So we're not all the way there, but we've come a very long way. You know, I think in a whole variety of ways, you know, we are no longer saying that gender is something that should keep people out. And we used to say that in a whole array of places. You know, we now have a female vice president. You know, there are still people who say we can't have a woman do that job. So, you know, great progress, still a ways, I think, a ways to go. One of the things that was another surprise for me in the study, I think speaks to some of that. It was a very pervasive idea in mental health that women were really vulnerable to depression as they got older, that menopause was really hard on women, that they felt like they were just, useless because they were no longer procreative, that they lost any sense of purpose when their children, when the nest emptied. And this was a very, very widespread attitude. I think it's changed a lot. What we found in our research was that actually in their 50s, women are women, and we actually did an additional cross-sectional study of Mills women, and it turned out for women who had graduated as far back as 1930 and up to 1970 when we did our work, that being in your 50s was a prime of life for women. So rather than it being a depressing time, it was the opposite. It was actually a great time. Well, you know, when you run into something where when you actually ask people their experience, it turns out to be so different than the picture that's been painted. You know, it's that kind of jarring thing that I think that maybe there's still work to be done about some of that stuff, you know? So I could go on and on, but I think that those kinds of things pretty much give an answer to your question.
Very good. Thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to the participants. So if you would like to participate and have a question for Valerie, please put your name in the text box or your question in the text box, and I'll call on you individually and I will unmute you so you can ask your question to Valerie. We do this to keep the noise down so that there are no issues with noise or competing noise in the questions. Does anybody have a question? I don't see any yet. Tell you what, let me ask you one more, because I have more questions. So I was going to ask you, okay, what were some of the challenges that you experienced doing a longitudinal study, or what are some things you would caution or tell people about that might be contemplating doing a longitudinal study?
Well, the first challenge is that is funding. That the way our grants work is that they're funded for a study with the expectation that that study can be completed in a relatively small amount of time. And so what we were faced with is that we had to write a new grant proposal every time we wanted to collect more data. And we had to hope that we would get funded, but it certainly wasn't a guarantee. And so that was definitely a challenge. And it's a happy ending to that story for us, fortunately. But it certainly is something. It's something to consider for sure. I think another thing for us, and we were very fortunate in this regard, is that if you're going to study people over time, you have to be able to stay in touch with them over time. And they have to be willing to continue to be studied over time. In terms of staying in touch with them, we really lucked out by doing the study of Mills College alumni, because their alumni association is very engaged and really was diligent in keeping track of everyone. So when we needed everybody's address for another round of data collection, they knew where to find, virtually everyone. And I have to say, it's one thing to find them, it's another thing to have them be willing to do all this work. When I came onto the study, the women were in their early 40s, and they had not been studied for 20 years for that time. And so we had just a mountain of questions for them. And we sent off all these questionnaires. One woman wrote us back, she said, I have been working on this for 40 hours now. So, oh my goodness, that people would be willing to take the time and be that reflective about their life. We asked them hard questions. Tell us about, how are your children doing? And some of them were not doing so well. Tell us about your divorce. These are not, tell us about bad times. We explicitly asked good times and bad times. And they were willing to manage the upsetting feelings that might come up, reflecting on those times, and be thoughtful and respond to all of our questions. And we had just the tiniest amount of atrophy in the study. I mean, we were still having over 100 women at the end. So we worked very hard to keep them engaged. We tried to well, for one, we absolutely treated them with respect. We really wanted them to know how much we appreciated what they were doing. We were very respectful of their privacy. But we also wanted to give back to them. So we would do things like, at one point we thought, well, they want to know how their personality is developing. So we took 3 series of their personality profiles at 3 different times and wrote each woman an individual synopsis of her personality and how it had evolved over 20 years. And sent this. So we really wanted to give back to them very directly, and really wanted to keep them engaged. And I think, their participation speaks to that. And there was a way that they felt supported by us, that there was something about, we were careful in the way that we asked our questions, so that no matter what you were doing, you could experience our interest as a supportive thing. And I think that helped too. I think the issue that you brought up before about, if you're doing a longitudinal study, you want it to be able to speak to the psychological issues and concepts that are current, that maybe hadn't even come to mind for anybody 20 years before. And so you want to be thinking about, well, is there a way that we can introduce these new concepts and measure them and be able to apply thinking about those concepts in these lives that we're studying. And you can, but you have to, you do have to think ahead about doing it. So those are I think are the main things.
All right, we have some questions, so I'm going to open it up. We have, let's see, going to unmute. We have a question from Juan Yan. Go ahead, Juan, ask your question.
Yeah, I was wondering, could you explain a little bit how can women live a satisfied and happy life for their whole life? Is there any suggestion?
Okay. Um, yeah, I think, um, you know, it's a complicated question that you're asking because what she will need to be able to do at different times in her life will be different. You know, what will make for a happy life at 50 is different than what will make for a happy life at 20, you know, and that's different than what will make for a happy life at 70. That being said, I think that there really are um, some strengths that if you develop with them, they give you a resource to navigate whatever is happening in your life. And I think one of them that is really important is acquiring a consolidated sense of your own identity. That, you know, identity continues to change throughout life, but you know, Erickson had this idea about, you know, identity, you know, you can achieve your identity. First, you have to ask the question, you know, who am I and where do I fit in the society? And then you have to come onto an answer and commit to it. And there was another researcher who said, okay, we can take these ideas about, you know, questioning and commitment and think of four possibilities. So we can think of people who don't question, but just commit. We can think of people who just question and don't commit. We can think of people who don't do either one, or we can think of the people who really achieve an identity because they question and they commit. And if you can get to that achieved position where you haven't just accepted the identity that was handed to you and never question it, you call it into question, you really say, you know, is this the identity for me? But when you come on an identity and you think, yeah, I think this is right for me, at least now, to be able to really commit to that and feel a consolidated sense of who you are, that there is something about the organization and energy that results from that that really contributes a great deal to a satisfying life.
Well, thank you. We'll go on to the next question. Octavia Macklin, I wanted to let you ask your question. Go ahead.
Hi there. I came late, so I'm not sure if this is addressed already, but did your study address culturally diverse populations, such as minorities or women of color?
I sort of hinted at that at the beginning, but let me just be very explicit about it. The answer is no. We absolutely did not. That the study, when we started it, you know, back in 1958, the decision to study seniors at Mills College came about because the feeling was, and this already wipes out a whole lot of diversity, they wanted to choose women from a pool of women who would have educational and financial resources that could allow them to realize their creative potential. So already we're not studying people who, for whatever reason, are not able to be in college. And then if you take a look at who was at Mills College in 1958, it wasn't totally homogeneous, but it was 99% homogeneous. I mean, this was a bunch of, you know, of affluent white women for the most part. There were a few people there on scholarship, very few. There were a few women of color, very few. So basically, this is a study of affluent white women.
Do you
And
have
I don't
any?
know, we could talk some more about that. You know, was that a good decision? Was it not? You know, I mean, I think certainly from today's point of view, I mean, for one thing, if from today's point of view, if you went to Mills College and took a sample, you would find a great deal of diversity there, you know, both in terms of, you know, ethnicity and in terms of social class. You know, Mills College has worked really hard to change, you know, so there's that aspect to it. But I think also that that it wasn't, I don't think it was even in the vocabulary of people in 1958. I don't think there was anybody even thinking about it. It was so weird just to study women at all, that the idea that you would want to really have, you know, a full representation of all women, I think it was like, hadn't even hit the radar screen.
Do you have a follow-up question, Octavia? Okay, we'll go on to the next participant. Candace Lynn, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. I appreciate the fact that you found and said that women in their 50s are really entering the, sort of the generativity part of their lives. And but I don't think that society views women over 50 in that way. So I was wondering if you could speak to how the women in your study were able to face, say, the misogyny and ageism that was there, to greet them, especially for those who, return to the workplace after perhaps, raising their children and staying home to do that, and maybe you can share your opinion as well on how women today can deal with those issues.
Yeah. They certainly did encounter both misogyny and ageism, and I think they well, one of the things that was very interesting to me was that about a third of our women in their early 70s had no intention of retiring. So why is that? Well, it turned out that the vast majority of those women who were not interested in retiring were self-employed. If you're self-employed, you don't have to face the misogyny from your boss. You don't have to face ageism from people above you. You're your own boss. And it made all the difference in the world. When we look at women who were employed by others, they talked about, I worry I'm going to lose my job. I worry I'm not being given interesting work any longer. And they were struggling, they were grappling with that stuff. And continuing to fight with it, and sometimes and retiring in greater numbers. They got out when they could, when they felt ready, but they were likely to be either retired or actively planning to by the time they were in their 70s. So I don't know that says a whole lot about how to fight it, but it does say, if there is a way that you can construct your life so that you really are in power, you really are self-employed, it has those added benefits to it. I think in other areas, I think that these women were pretty good as they got older. Most of them had gotten back into the workforce earlier than their 50s, so they were already working. Some really wanted to have careers. Some were ambivalent. Some just had a job and didn't really regard it as a career. And I think that they were what we heard more about were women who were happily surprised at being very supported in the workplace. Which suggests that they were surprised, that they didn't expect it, and were really happy when it came along. And I think that they were aware of it, that they struggled as best they could, but that a lot of them really felt that they didn't have the power to really be able to grapple with it in an effective way. Outside of the workplace, I was struck. This was an active bunch of women in their 70s, and they tended to find things to do where they were. They thought what they were doing was valuable, and other people valued it too. And so I think that they didn't run into the kind of attempts to diminish them or humiliate them that they might have if they had not been pretty choosy about where they went. I think our favorite example of generativity in the book is a woman who retired at 60, about 60, because her husband had really asked her to retire. She'd been a high school teacher, and they were really looking forward to having this wonderful retirement together. Well, 4 months after she retired, he got cancer, and 2 months after that, he died. And she was just decimated. I mean, her whole life plan just sank. And it took her, a couple of years to kind of get back on her feet again. But what happened, and she writes to us just marvelously about this. She said, over time, and she was a very proactive person. She joined a grief group, and she tried to meditate, and she did all these things to try and build herself back together. She said, but along the way that she found herself thinking about, well, what are things that I used to think about? And she recalled that she at one time had this dream of going to Africa and teaching mathematics to girls in Africa. So she decided she was going to go explore this. So sure enough, she went to Africa and connected up with some people there and talked with them. And the first thing she found out is that she couldn't teach mathematics to the girls in Africa because there was no girls' school. Most of the schools were boarding schools, and they couldn't be co-ed. And so they chose the boys. And so she realized, oh, well, I shouldn't be here in Africa trying to teach mathematics. I should go home and raise money to build a girls' school. Well, she did. And so, she raised, the last time we heard from her, she was 77. She had raised $250,000. She had built a school that housed over 300 girls. It had a computer lab, had a science lab. She'd done all this stuff. Nobody was going to be on her case for being a woman or being old. And I mean, that's a real stunning example of somebody who's, her passion was there, and and everybody was delighted.
I'll look for it for you. Okay. And then this was on the front desk.
Candace, did you have any follow-up questions?
I can't hear her.
Candace, did you have any? I just asked you to.
Sorry, yeah, I just got the permission to unmute from you, so I'm sorry. Yeah, so just, thank you, Dr. Mitchell. And I think that, I'm wondering if, a lot of the fact that they weren't really sort of oppressed in the way that we might have imagined had to do with their race and their privilege.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, these are women who all started out with, a big financial cushion, and they likely, matched with a spouse who was going to maintain that kind of financial cushion. And they had all of the privilege of all that whiteness.
But regardless, in answer to, well, how do we face it today? I really appreciate just hearing the stories of, the women who have gone before, and that includes you. So thank you. Yeah.
You're very welcome.
So the next question is from Joshua Scott. Joshua, I've asked you to go on video and to unmute.
Okay. Yep. Okay. My question is, I found it really fascinating. Since I've been in my MFT program, feminism has really brought that part of the course really brought a lot of attention to me on how females are treated in our society and how females were treated in the past. When you brought up the comment about how when somebody looks for a job in the past, there would be two sections, one female, one male. And I found that really fascinating. I'm like, wow, really? I mean, because in my day and age, we didn't ever see that in my.
Yeah.
So my question is, how do you view social media, I guess, advertising to women for jobs? And do you think they're doing justice, or do you think there's room to grow so women are able, young women, older women, doesn't matter your age, you have the access to be an engineer, you have an access to be a professor, start your own study. How do you think social media is playing a role in that?
Well, I think about with jobs like becoming an engineer or being a professor, that the idea that there's a pipeline, that you have to look at the choices made early, and so what I'm thinking are, what are the things that teenage girls are seeing? What are they getting when they log on and whatever they're looking at? And I think people are at work on that, but I think that they have a long ways to go. It's an interesting thing to me is, for example, video games. People tend to think of video games as really a male province. Well, I'm not so sure that that's quite so true, but it's interesting to think about. Well, who's designing the games? What makes the games interesting? If you thought your audience was a little bit different in some way, would you design a game differently? Just some things like that that are very intriguing to me. Just as an aside, I once chaired a dissertation at Alliant of someone who was looking at massive multiplayer role-playing games and looking at people who chose an avatar who was not their gender and asking them, why did they do that? And what emerged was the most sexist set of rationales you would ever imagine. So it's like, whoa, the sexism is lurking, in so many of these places. And I think it needs to be called out, and that people need to say, hey, is that really what we want to be doing? Is that really the message we want to be giving, to men and to women?
And I haven't.
If you're going to go toward engineering, and there's a lot of work that's been done on this. I don't know that it's been done in relation to social media, which would be definitely a place to do it. But I know there are a lot of interventions that have come into play to encourage girls to get the interest and the identity and the knowledge that they need to get launched into science in college. Because you're not going to get to be the engineer if you get to college and you are not interested in engineering.
And I just have one more comment, and I have had a long debate about this because I am a firm believer that the United States is ready for a woman's president. I'm a firm believer that it's time for women to maybe step up to higher office and see what they can bring to the table. But with my grandmother, who's 86 years old, she doesn't feel that way. She said the United States is not ready for a woman's president or even a vice president. And I'm like, well, it's such a big step. It's such a great thing. No, it's not. So how do I convince her that a woman is ready to be president or vice president? Or should I just leave it alone? Because in her generation, as you were saying, the mind frame of women back in the 30s, 40s, 50s was completely different than today.
Yeah. I think that's where I would start in my conversation with her. Is like, I understand where you're coming from. If we were all raised to believe that the one thing women would be good at is being a wife and mother, well, I could see that you would think that there were a whole lot of things that women shouldn't do, because you believe that the one thing they're good at is this one thing. But Grandma, as you've seen, as the years have gone by, women are doing a lot of different things now, and they turn out to be as good as men at it. Some are good, some are not so good, just like the men. And so if you were to change that fundamental assumption and you were to think, oh, as I look around me and I look at the kind of jobs that women are doing now, maybe I would think a little differently about it. It's hard, I mean, I am really struck by, with the women in the Mills study, that the women's movement, came along too late for some of them. They were committed to, the role that they were in, and they were going to stick to it. And some of them did, and some of them didn't, but I think it gets harder to really allow yourself to be gripped by social change, depending on when you experienced it. There's actually some research to support that if you experience the Great Depression as a child, it was one experience. If you experience it as a young adult, it was another experience. If you experience it as a middle-aged person, it was yet still a different experience. And so she's experiencing, gosh, if she's 86, she must have been in maybe her late 30s when the women's movement came along. And she had made a whole set of adult decisions for her life based on the world the way she was led to understand it. And so, it could be that a lot of that just kind of didn't feel personally relevant to her at all, and she didn't pay much attention to it.
Yeah, I don't think, and it had a lot to do with her own mother, because her own mother at the time when I was doing my genogram, and I was also looking at history of the women's and how women back then thought about the movement. Her mother was totally against the movement. She said, they're crazy. They think they're going to change. Like, that's what my mother told me. They thought they're going to change the world. And, a funny thing, in my family, a lot of the women in my family are professors, university professors. A couple of them are scientists and educators. So we have women that have made a lot of grounds, but she's still, I don't know.
What does your grandmother think of them?
They're crazy, and I don't know. It might be a Southern thing or something, because she's from Texas or something. She's from Texas, so it might be because in the state of Texas it's completely different than California, maybe. But she just thinks they have kids and they should be home with their kids and they shouldn't be going to, teaching school and doing this and this. I'm like, well, they do it all, and their husbands are very supportive and they all work together as a team. So yeah, we sort of laugh about it in a way, but yeah.
It's a really, I think it's educational for you to see. Now here's someone who's alive today who has a vision of the world that is so drastically different from the world that you see, you know? And it really, when you start looking like at these lives and you think about your own life, what's going to change in your lifetime, that you look back and you think, oh, remember we used to think this and now we think practically the opposite of that. it's really something. But yeah, she sounds like she is, not only does she have her point of view, but she has a real passion for it. You know,
Very,
she get mad
yes.
at these women who are doing the wrong thing.
She's a very strong woman. So when my grandfather was alive, she was the one that ruled the house, and it's what she said, and it was her way or the highway. And she would tell my grandfather, "It's the highway if you don't want to listen to me." And he was a very, he would listen to her. He was really in love with her, so he didn't care. So he's like, "Okay, what? Yeah, Carol, we'll do that." So.
Well, that adds an interesting complication to all this, huh? Because her vision of what it means to be a wife, is certainly not a submissive one.
No, definitely not.
She had her ideas, and that was what was going to happen.
Yep.
We have a few more people that have questions. I just want to go to the next question. Tiffany Hibbert, I'm going to go ahead and you go ahead and do your question.
Dr. Mitchell, thank you so much for your research and for sharing it with us. I think my question is probably a two-part question. You spoke about the fact or your finding that women tend to become more generative in the second half of life after maybe family and career launches in the first half of life. And Candace might have addressed this as well, her question, but what did you find as the general age range for that shift, milestones, or just in general, what did you find propels that shift?
Well, I think that these shifts toward what is important in the second half of life are gradual. They're kind of subtle. There's not like big marker event. I mean, the story that I told about the woman who went to Africa, it sounds like there was like this marker moment, but I think it was brewing for a while, and I think for most of the women that both, the generativity and the individuation and the integrity and, the interest in cultivating wisdom and self-reflection, all that stuff, it just becomes gradually more interesting, gradually more important to them. And so I would be looking at that. I mean, what we can see it clearly, because we're asking what's important to you every 10 years. And so, I remember one woman who was, she had a career, she had a family, and, you talk to her at 40 and she says, "Oh, I'm just, I'm just a go-getter person, and I'm just so busy all the time. And, I kind of wish I had a little more time that I could, step back and reflect. I probably should cultivate that." And then you read her 10 years later, and it's like, well, I've decided to cut back to 3/4 time in my work because I need to have time for myself. And so over that 10 years, that little hint of I need more time has grown into actual action steps to find the time, but not in some big sort of leap, kind of a gradual transition. I think a big part of it, has to do with people reflecting on their life. You have your children and you raise them, and in our society we all hope that they launch, and when they launch, you're still very involved with them and you care about them a great deal, but you're not having to drive them places and make their lunch every day and do all this stuff. So it's very different. And as those things sort of have a certain kind of evolution into something that occupies a smaller amount of daily time, I think people start thinking about, well, how do I want to spend my time? And another piece that starts coming in, and we can see it evolve over those years of 40, 50, 60 is, initially we had this idea of the social clock and people feeling a lot of social pressure to do things and get their career going and get their family going. we asked women at around 50, well, we asked them a couple of things. We asked them, do you think your life followed the dictates of the social clock? But then we asked them, what do you think the social clock says to you now? And they wrote back really consistently, like, what a crazy idea. One woman said, nobody gives a hoot what I'm going to do. Nobody wants to tell me what to do at 50. So they really have that freed up. And that leaves room to say, well, if nobody else, if I'm not feeling any pressure to do the right thing, what everybody says a person should do, well, what do I want to do? And I think another piece that gets added in there is that people are aware of getting older. And there's a certain point where, we all know that we have a finite life, but there's a certain point where it really comes alive. One researcher writes about that there's a point where, as a younger person, you're most aware of how long you've lived. And there becomes a certain point where you're more thinking about how much longer do I have to live. When you make that shift, then it leads to different kinds of thinking. It's like, well, I'd like to do things that leave a legacy, that I've contributed something to, make things better after I'm gone. I think that's some of the motivation for people with their children is, when I'm gone, my children will be here and, maybe they can make the world a better place than I could, and maybe I've helped them to be able to do that. But I think in addition to that, that there's a more general kind of feeling of, can I want to do this in the time that I have remaining. I want to do some things that would, help maintain the things we value or create something new and useful, or, just make the world a better place. And that starts to come into people's thinking. I think the same sort of thing also really motivates, really powers self-development, that people start to feel like, wow, am I the person I really want to be? And if I'm not, there's no time like the present. I better get on it, and really kind of do some of that inner work to become the person, as close to the person that I want to be as I can. So I hope that kind of answers your question. Yeah?
Okay, we got it.
Okay.
That is very, I appreciate all that you said. And it makes me think too, when you're referring to first and second half, like there's a lot of variety, like the one example you gave of a woman in her 60s, really having that shift towards generativity because of events that opened up. And it makes me wonder also, because of such different timings for women expectations, if there's an opportunity for that generativity and focus on caring for others and one's identity at much younger of an age on average.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And all I can really say about it is that that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer. Right. But you all listening to this, here's a lovely research opportunity. Let's take a look at that. What are younger women doing in terms of generativity? And how did those opportunities become available for them and maybe weren't there for women at earlier times? And in the other direction too, as women, tend to launch their families later, does that affect their generativity in later life? Wonderful questions, Yeah.
That's a good point.
I would love to know what if I were, going to wave my magic wand and start my career over again now, and the Mills study existed, I would love to compare the Mills study with a new cohort coming through and see if the personality patterns are maintained. I think it would be fascinating to see, well, what actually is the impact of these drastic changes in opportunities and drastic changes in timing. It would just be fascinating to find that out.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell.
Hi, I think, Dr. Jones, I think you're currently muted.
Sorry. The next question is for Farah Shattuck. Go ahead, Farah, and I'll.
Yeah, sure, thank you. So yeah, I just want to say thank you for this incredible webinar just to discuss such an important topic. I was curious if you may have any areas you particularly would like to see research flourish. And I know you touched on this a bit already, but just some more topics on women that you think there are some gaps in currently with the research.
Oh, I feel like it's overflowing. You know, there's more gaps than there are not gaps. You know, that there's almost everything that about women's lives that could really benefit from more study. In terms of my personal interest, I mean, I would love to see, in our work, we really use the big 5 personality traits, and the second half of life, we talked about three paths of development, 3 really different kinds of lives. And those kinds of lives were really supported by a different each one had a different configuration of personality. And I guess I would be fascinated to be able to follow, you know, women who are high and low on some of these personality configurations and see, you know, do they carry them forward in the same way under very different conditions or not? You know, have circumstances changed so much that maybe a different configuration of personality is required? For example, I mentioned before that for a lot of these women, it took a lot of courage and determination to be able to hold on to their creativity and turn it into an area of achievement for them. I don't know if it takes that much courage and determination in the same kind of way. It might take more just plain perseverance now, you know, because there might be less disapproval. I don't know whether that's true, or maybe it isn't true. Maybe it stayed the same. You know, so I think that would be very interesting to me to see, you know, just personality was so important in, you know, what people did with their lives and whether different aspects of their life experience went well or not very well. I think that would be what I would love to see is, you know, let's take a look in a longitudinal way about the impact of personality on women's lives.
Farah, did you have a follow-up question? Farah, did you have a follow-up question at all or any comments? Okay, I'm going to go to Christian Curry next. Christian, I've asked you to start your video and go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, thank you. So I may have missed this early on in the discussion, but I'm wondering, as a researcher, how did the process of conducting this study influence your own perspective, just given the times and the uniqueness of studying women?
Well, I think I was very aware from the very beginning that I was kind of I had the tremendous good fortune to have landed on this little island of feminist research in a great sea of not, you know, and I think that that remained true for me all the way through my career, you know, that I was really, there really was nothing like this, you know, around. And I knew that. And I could see, you know, decade after decade, as more and more articles came out about different aspects of these women's lives, that it was so rich and made women's lives visible. I mean, women's lives are still not very visible. You know, I mean, when you all take, you know, developmental psychology, take a look at how much is there about women's lifespan. You know, there's not a lot. One of the things that we really hope with our book is that it will land on some developmental psychology classes, so that people don't just read, you know, the lifespan studies of men, but also the lifespan study of women. And I think that for me, was always there, you know. I mean, I was, you know, I was not, once I graduated, I had my own academic work to do, and I couldn't be as involved with it as my mentor, who was a research psychologist. Research was really all she did. But I could always dip into it, you know, and I continuously did. So when I had an opportunity, we'd write about some other aspect, or we'd write about this other aspect. And that stayed true all the way through my career, from the first thing I ever published, and I can't say the last thing I ever published, but pretty close. But that was such a wonderful, wonderful thing for me. And I think that it, I think it informed my my life as a teacher. You know, I think it informed the kind of stuff that I wrote about, that I always knew in the back of my mind that this was really a big part of the purpose, was to get, you know, people talk about, you know, populations being marginalized, you know, and the only way to get out of the margin is to get into the text, you know, is to get stuff known about you and maybe be visible. And so I think that was part of what motivated me pretty much every step of the way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Kristen, did you have any more, did you have a follow-up question?
Oh, I could go on for hours, but no, thank you.
Me too.
I didn't see any other questions, so I wanted to go ahead. We've hit the hour-and-a-half mark, so I want to go ahead and wrap this up. Dr. Mitchell, I wanted to thank you for talking to us about your book, Women in the River of Life, and the Mills study. This has been a wonderful talk, and I appreciate you answering all the questions that I had and everybody else had. It's been a wonderful talk. The book is available on Amazon.com, and I provided a link in the comments that you can go to purchase it if you'd like, or you can always go back and look for it under Women in the River of Life. So it's available again on Amazon. And we're also going to have it in the library soon too. So that'll be something you could also utilize as well. So thank you very much for being here today and talking with us. Really enjoyed this. This has been a wonderful talk.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it too. Thank you all.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and cut off now.